Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we turn our gaze toward the long forgotten fields and frostbitten paths of the past, to the world of those who toiled quietly and endlessly beneath the weight of medieval life. This is the harsh life of medieval peasants, a slow, steady walk through a time when survival was not a story of glory or grandeur, but of mud-caked boots, aching backs, and hopes planted like seeds in cold, uncertain soil. As we begin this gentle descent into centuries of toil and silence, I invite you to settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let your thoughts drift. And if you'd like, feel free to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. There's something quietly reassuring about seeing the scattered lights of our late-night world glowing in one place. And if these calm, reflective journeys through the quieter corners of history bring you rest, consider subscribing. There are many more stories to tell. Now, take a deep breath and let's begin. It is early morning, but the sun has not yet crested the low, damp hills beyond the village. The air smells of smoke, wet straw, and the quiet sourness of unwashed wool. A thin mist hugs the earth like a second skin, slipping between fence posts and the cracked wooden beams of homes that lean like tired men against the weight of another day. Somewhere, a rooster crows with little enthusiasm, its cry wallowed by the fog. Beneath a fraying thatched roof, a peasant stirs. His name is of no consequence, not to history, not to his lord, and not even to the neighboring village. He is one of hundreds, perhaps thousands, whose lives pass in silence, barely rippling the surface of the age. He wakes on a bed of straw that crunches with fleas and mouse droppings, tucked beneath a woolen blanket that hasn't been properly washed since last harvest. His wife is already gone, rising earlier still to tend to the goats and scrape porridge from the blackened pot over the hearth. The fire has gone out. It always does. Wood is scarce and the forest is not free. Cutting from it without permission could mean a fine, or worse. Outside, the path is slick with last night's rain, the mud thick and ankle deep. His toes curl inside stiff leather shoes, patched so many times they barely resemble footwear. He is already late. The bell from the manor house rang while he was still asleep. It means the workday has begun, though truthfully, it never really ends. The peasant's life is not measured in hours or wages, but in the number of tasks left undone before night falls again. He trudges past the pigsty, the animals snorting and rooting in filth, past the spinning wheel his wife will sit at for hours later tonight, past the other hovels that look exactly like his own, their doors hanging slightly ajar, their windows shuttered to keep out the wind. The fields await, fields of rye, barley, and wheat that do not belong to him. He is allowed to farm a narrow strip of land for his own family, just enough to keep them from starving, usually. But the rest, he works for the Lord. He owes labor, and taxes, and grain, and sometimes poultry, depending on the season. In return, he is granted the privilege of not being evicted, not being fined, not being imprisoned. It is not protection, so much as permission to survive. Today, the task is threshing. His hands, already blistered and calloused, grip the flail with familiarity. The work is rhythmic, numbing. Hours pass with the dull smack of wood on grain, dust rising into his throat and eyes until everything tastes like earth. There is little talk. The others around him, men and boys mostly, labor in the same slow, mechanical way. Their bodies are bent not from age, but from routine. A short break at midday brings a crust of bread, maybe a bit of onion or cheese, if luck has been kind. No one sits for long. There is too much to do. The reeve walks among them, eyes sharp, looking for signs of laziness, disobedience, theft. He reports to the steward, who reports to the Lord, who likely has never touched a flail in his life. In the distance, the manor rises like a stone reminder of who matters and who does not. By evening, the peasant's arms ache so deeply, he wonders if they will move again in the morning. He trudges home through mud that has deepened with the afternoon drizzle, slipping once, catching himself on a fence. No one helps. Everyone is tired. Back at the hut, his wife hands him a bowl of thin pottage. It tastes of leeks and salt and not much else. They eat in silence while the children squabble nearby. One of them is coughing again, a deep, wet cough that has not gone away since winter. They cannot afford a healer. Tomorrow, he will go to the woods and try to gather herbs without being seen. After supper, he fixes the leak in the roof with some straw and clay, then sharpens a broken tool by candlelight. There is no time to rest properly. There is no such thing as rest, not really. Only short moments of stillness between the demands of the day and the weight of what's to come. The fire is out again. The youngest child whimpers in the dark, frightened by wind against the shutter. He murmurs a lullaby, half remembered from his own childhood, and the child quiets. The hut smells of smoke and sweat and wet wool. He lies back on the straw, closing his eyes, knowing the same routine waits tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, until sickness or accident or hunger takes him. And no one will remember his name, because in the grand sweep of history, peasants are the background noise. But they were there, in every field, behind every harvest, beneath every stone tower, built with hands like his, silent, tireless, forgotten. The rain begins before dawn, a slow, persistent drizzle that turns the hard, packed earth to soup and seeps through every crack in every roof across the village. There is no thunder, no wind, just that steady, endless dripping, like time itself leaking away. Inside the hut, the sound is constant, drumming on the thatch above, slipping in along the walls, forming shallow pools on the dirt floor. The peasant wakes not with surprise, but with a sigh. Rain means the day will be harder, not easier. The fields will be slick and heavy. Tools will rot faster. Clothes will stay damp for days. He sits up slowly, joints stiff from cold and yesterday's labor, and pulls on his tunic, still damp from yesterday's sweat. The fire didn't survive the night. They have no dry wood left. His wife is crouched in the corner, wrapping wet linen around her feet before tying on her shoes. She doesn't speak. There's no need. They both know what must be done. The children are still asleep, huddled in a pile for warmth, their breath fogging faintly in the chill air. He steps outside and is greeted by the full weight of the season. The world is gray, soft, and sinking. Pigs grunt in the muck, their snouts already buried in wet straw. Chickens flap and mutter beneath the eaves, trying to stay dry. The village path has disappeared beneath layers of standing water and churned mud. Still, he walks, each step a squelch, each movement a fight against the pull of the earth. Work won't stop for weather. The Lord's crops need tending, and the rain is no excuse. There are weeds to be pulled, even in the wet. Ditches must be cleared to keep the water from flooding the lower fields. Fences, damaged by last week's windstorm, must be patched before the livestock wander. He shoulders a broken spade and begins the long walk toward the edge of the estate. Other peasants join him silently, their forms hunched beneath cloaks that do little to repel the water. One coughs loudly, spitting something dark onto the ground. No one stops. Sickness is a constant, woven into life like hunger and blisters. The ditch is half full by the time they arrive, swollen with runoff and clogged with branches. He sinks his spade into the muck and begins to dig. It is slow, miserable work. His hands are numb before long, the handle slick with rain and slime. He slips once, landing hard on a rock hidden beneath the surface. Pain shoots up his leg, but he does not cry out. There is no one to help him, and nothing to be done. He stands again, wincing, and resumes the rhythm of work. Dig, lift, toss, dig, lift, toss. Hours pass. Rain continues. His clothes are soaked through, heavy and clinging, chafing at the joints. His stomach growls, but he ignores it. The midday meal will be thin, an oat cake wrapped in a damp cloth, a few cold turnips. He eats quickly beneath the shelter of a bent tree, sharing space with two others who do not speak. Their faces are streaked with mud, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. They chew without pleasure, without rest. Then, back to work. More ditches, more pulling of sodden weeds from the barley rows. The rain never stops. His fingers are wrinkled and white, skin beginning to split along the nails. He does not remember the last time he was dry. By the time the sun slips behind the gray horizon, he has finished clearing a dozen yards of waterlogged trench. He limps back to the village, feet dragging through puddles that feel colder than snow. Inside the hut, the fire is barely more than an ember. His wife has boiled a few onions in broth, thin, cloudy water with more salt than flavor. He eats slowly, savoring every bit. The children pick at crusts of bread, eyes drooping. One of them shivers violently. She's had a fever since yesterday. His wife presses a damp cloth to her forehead, but there's little else they can do. He sits by the fire and wrings out his cloak, watching the water drip into the dirt. The room smells of wet wood and mildew. Outside, the rain still falls. He thinks of tomorrow, of more trenches, more weeds, more cold, and then pushes the thought away. There's no space in his mind for tomorrow. Only sleep, and maybe a dream if he's lucky. Something warm, something dry, something that doesn't hurt. But he knows, even in his bones, that dreams are luxury. In this world, sleep is only a pause. The labor never stops. The rain never ends. And no one, not even the priests, can tell him why this is his lot or whether it will ever change. He lies down beside his children, pulling the thin blanket over them all, and listens to the drip, drip, drip of water against the roof and tries not to think. The frost came early that year, creeping in with a silence sharper than any blade. It laced the edges of leaves in silver and turned the already hard soil into something brittle, something that cracked beneath the heel like old bones. There was no snow yet, just a bone-deep cold that refused to leave, even in the daylight. The peasants noticed it first in their hands, the way their fingers stiffened too quickly when tying bundles of firewood, the way their breath lingered longer in the air, swirling like ghosts above the fields. There was no firewood left, not really. Most of it had been used in the last cold snap, and the scraps that remained were damp and slow to burn. The forest nearby was not theirs to touch. A tree, a branch, even a fallen log, those belonged to the Lord, and taking them was theft. And theft meant punishment. So instead, the peasant and his neighbors scavenged for brush, for dry dung, for anything that might give off heat, however fleeting. This morning, he rose before the light, as always, and stepped out into a world rimmed with ice. His breath caught in his throat, not from awe, but from pain. The chill stabbed his lungs, made his nose run, and his eyes water. He rubbed his arms, but the threadbare wool did little. The fire inside had gone out long ago, and there was nothing to relight it with. His wife lay under the covers with the children, trying to keep their shared body heat from escaping. He could not stay. The animals needed feeding. The Lord's granary needed restocking. There was manure to haul and fences to mend, though the ground was too hard to dig into. He walked with a limp, the frostbite from last winter having never fully healed. His right foot always ached when the cold came, turning purple if he stayed still too long. The path was quiet. No birds sang. The village looked like it was holding its breath, waiting for the sun to rise and warm it. But the sun, when it did rise, brought no comfort. Its light was pale and weak, barely slicing through the gray clouds that hung low and heavy. The fields were stubbled with frost-bitten stalks. Most of the harvest had already been collected, but not by the peasants. That had gone to the Lord: barrels of wheat, baskets of barley, sacks of oats, enough to fill his cellars, enough to keep his house warm and his table full. The peasant had a few turnips, a half bag of dried beans, and a salted fish that was already beginning to smell. He would make it last, somehow. He always did. But winter stretched ahead like a tunnel with no light at the end. Today's work was carrying sacks of grain from the mill to the manor storehouse. The sacks were heavy, and the straps bit into his shoulders. The cold made everything slower. His fingers didn't grip the way they used to. Every time he stumbled, the overseer shouted. There was no room for error. A dropped sack meant a beating. He did not drop any, though his arms trembled and his vision blurred from the effort. By midday, his stomach was twisting with hunger, but there was no time to eat. The brake bell never rang. It hadn't rung since the last reeve was replaced. This one believed hunger made for faster hands. The peasant believed it too, in a way. Hunger made you desperate. Desperation made you obedient. By dusk, his tunic was stiff with sweat and frost. He returned to the hut with a bundle of straw under one arm and a splinter in his thumb. His wife handed him a wooden bowl. It held a watery porridge, gray and steaming faintly. The children ate theirs with their hands, scooping quickly, not wasting a drop. No one spoke. Words were too precious to waste on complaints. After the meal, he sat by the hearth, staring into the dark pit where the fire should have been. He pressed his foot, the purple one, and winced at the pain. If it blackened, they would have to cut it off. There was no healer nearby. The priest might say a prayer, but God, it seemed, had long ago turned his face from this village. He lay down with the others, pulling the blanket over them all, and stared at the ceiling where a spider moved slowly across the beams. The cold would be worse tomorrow. It always was. But for now, there was the quiet sound of breathing, the rise and fall of tiny chests beside him, the slow comfort of closeness in the dark. It was not warmth, but it was something. And sometimes, in the long, frozen stillness of a peasant's winter, something was all there was. The hunger came not as a sudden pain, but as a slow forgetting. First of satisfaction, then of fullness, then finally of what it felt like to eat without measuring every bite. It crept in with the shortening days and deepened with the cold as the stored food dwindled and the hope of more faded with the last frost-bitten vegetables. The peasant knew it was coming. They all did. It was the same every year. The thin months they whispered about as autumn turned to ice. January and February, the hunger months, when the ground was hard and empty, and even the rats grew thin. This morning, the peasant stirred with a hollow feeling in his gut, not sharp enough to double him over, but deep enough that it followed him from sleep into waking like a shadow stitched to his ribs. He sat up and looked at the others. His wife had her eyes open already, watching the children, two of whom were still sleeping. The third, the youngest, had cried himself into exhaustion the night before, belly bloated from water and nothing else. There was no fire, no pot simmering, no bread on the shelf. They had a few onions, soft and sprouting at the top, and a strip of dried meat, hard as wood and just as tasteless. She would boil it later, with water, make something warm at least, but it wouldn't be enough. It never was. Outside, the wind had changed. It blew from the north today, carrying with it the sharp sting of something colder than winter, something hungrier. The village path was quiet, footsteps muffled in the thick mud that had turned to frost in the night. The peasant passed others as he walked, but none of them spoke. Conversation had become a kind of luxury. They all wore the same face now, gray, gaunt, eyes ringed with fatigue. The baker's wife, who used to laugh in the mornings, now stared at the ground. The smith, once thick-armed and broad, had a hollow under his cheekbones you could rest a thumb in. At the edge of the village, near the withered barley fields, a woman knelt in the frost, digging with her bare hands into the dirt, as if something might be hiding there, waiting to be found. A turnip, perhaps, or a miracle. He turned away and walked toward the manor. There was always work to be done, even when there was nothing to eat. Today, he was hauling stones to repair the fence around the pig pens. The Lord had acquired new swine, fatter, healthier, fed on things the peasant would never taste. The stones were slick with ice, and his fingers kept slipping. The overseer shouted once, then again, then simply raised his arm and brought the stick down across the peasant's back. He didn't cry out. No one did. Not anymore. The pain was just another thread in the fabric of the day. He lifted the stone again, heaved it onto the cart, and moved on. By noon, the cold had crawled up through the soles of his boots and settled into his knees. He bit the inside of his cheek until it bled, just to distract himself from the ache in his hands. When the sun passed its peak, the workers paused briefly. Some leaned against trees, some sat in the mud, others simply stood, swaying slightly, as if afraid to stop moving altogether. The peasant chewed a piece of bark he had torn from a tree. It tasted bitter and did nothing, but it was something in his mouth, something to pretend with. Then the bell rang again, and the illusion broke. The work resumed. By dusk, he could no longer feel his toes. His back throbbed with the rhythm of his heartbeat. As he walked home, he saw two boys fighting over something in the road. A crust of bread, he thought, or maybe just the hope of one. No one intervened. Hunger had stripped them of judgment. At the hut, the pot was on the fire. Thin broth, more water than anything else, but hot and smelling faintly of meat. He drank it slowly, letting the steam sting his face. The children ate in silence. The youngest, too weak to sit up, leaned against his mother's shoulder. Afterward, they lay together on the straw. He pulled the blanket higher and listened to the wind pressing against the walls. Hunger, he thought, was a thief. It stole not just flesh, but kindness, patience, sleep, memory. He could not remember the last time he laughed. He did not know if he would again. Tomorrow, they would eat the last of the onions. The day after, perhaps nothing. But for tonight, there was still breath, still warmth in the closeness of their bodies, still something like love buried beneath the ache. And in the dark, as his stomach twisted and his thoughts frayed, the peasant stared into the blackness and did what he had always done. Waited for the next morning, and the one after that, and the one after that, until spring or death came to claim him. The spring did not arrive with celebration. It crept in slowly, suspiciously, like a traveler unsure of its welcome, slipping its fingers into the soil while frost still clung to the edges of the thatch. The air began to change, just barely. A breeze no longer carried quite the same sting, and the icicles that had hung like knives from the eaves began to weep, fat droplets tapping out the first hesitant rhythm of thaw. But no one in the village dared to hope too soon. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment, and disappointment was a luxury they could not afford. The peasant woke before the sun, as always, but today, the air inside the hut did not freeze his lungs with the first breath. It was still cold, but not cruel. He rubbed the stiffness from his fingers and stepped outside, half expecting to see snow. But instead, he saw mud. A different kind of struggle. The kind that sucked at your boots and swallowed cartwheels. But at least it meant the ground was softening. His wife was already tending to the goats. One of them had died in the final frost, but the others had survived, thin and bleeding. She held a wooden bowl under one, trying to coax a few drops of milk into it. The children were beginning to cough less. The youngest still didn't speak, but her fever had broken, and that was enough to keep the peasant moving. Today, he would walk to the far edge of the manor's land, to the new field they'd been ordered to clear. The Lord wanted more oats planted this year. He always wanted more, and the clearing would not be easy, full of roots, rocks, and old brush that had to be burned or dragged away. But there was something comforting in the work. Not easy, not pleasant, but simple, direct. A task that required only effort, not thought. As he walked, the road was still half frozen in places, the ruts filled with thin ice that cracked beneath his steps. He passed other peasants, some carrying bundles of twigs, others dragging shovels, all of them hunched, quiet, and watching the horizon for any sign of warmth. One man stopped him to trade 2 onions for a needle and thread. The peasant had no onions. He kept walking. The clearing was further than he remembered. By the time he reached it, his legs ached and his stomach growled, but he said nothing. The overseer pointed to a patch near the edge, full of brambles and stubborn roots. The peasant nodded and took up the worn spade. Dig, cut, pull, repeat. The hours passed without words. His hands bled, his knees stiffened. But there was sun now, pale, watery, but real, and it warmed his neck as he worked. By midday, the brambles were piled high in a crude heap, ready to burn. The smoke would carry for miles, the scent of labor drifting across the estate like a signal. They were readying the earth again, not for themselves, not really. The grain would go to the Lord, but the act of turning soil still brought something like meaning, even if it was borrowed. He paused only once, leaning on the spade, watching a robin land nearby, small, red-chested, picking at a worm. The first bird he had seen in weeks. He did not smile, but he watched until it flew away. That night, his wife served nettle soup, thin but fresh, and the children ate with more energy than before. They even squabbled over the last piece of bread, which was hard as stone but better than nothing. The peasant sat beside the fire and stitched a tear in his tunic, the borrowed needle scraping softly against the cloth. His wife hummed something low, tuneless, just a sound to fill the air, and for the first time in what felt like months, he let himself believe the worst might be behind them. He still remembered the dead, old Thomas who hadn't made it through the frost, the girl with the broken leg who simply stopped breathing one night, the neighbor whose cough never left. But their stories were already fading, swallowed by the turning of the seasons. Spring would come, fully and inescapably. The trees would bud. The animals would give birth. The rains would turn the earth soft and black and ready. And the cycle would begin again. Planting, tending, harvesting, tithing, enduring. He would not rest. He would not celebrate, but he would endure. That was all a peasant ever did. Endure. Through the cold, through the hunger, through the silence and the ash and the aching joints. He lay back on the straw and listened to the breathing around him, his wife, his children, alive for now. The fire cracked, Outside, somewhere, a night bird sang. He closed his eyes and let the sound of it carry him gently into sleep. The sun rose earlier now, streaking the sky with a faded gold that made the frost on the grass glint like scattered glass, though it melted quickly under the growing warmth. The peasant did not admire it. Beauty, in his world, was something seen without feeling, something that passed through the eye but never touched the heart, because the weight of the day ahead allowed no room for softness. Today was sowing day. A cart had arrived from the manor at first light, creaking and groaning under sacks of seed that would be doled out to each peasant in careful measure, watched over by the steward's narrow eyes. Not too much for any one man, and certainly none to be wasted. It was the kind of morning where everything hurt a little less, where the air smelled more of soil than smoke, and even the animals moved with a restless energy, sensing the turning of the season. The peasant stood in the furrowed field, squinting into the rising sun, the sack of seed rough against his hip. The earth beneath his feet was cool, freshly turned, and not yet hard. With each step, he cast the seed in careful arcs, not too heavy, not too light, letting it fall like dust into the furrows he and the others had spent weeks carving out of the frozen ground. His hand moved with practiced rhythm, muscle memory doing what the mind could no longer afford to think about. There were no conversations in the field, only the sound of boots on dirt, the quiet rustle of grain, the occasional grunt of exertion. They all worked in silence, not out of solemnity, but out of habit. Words were saved for when they were needed, and today there was nothing to say. As he walked, the peasant thought of last year's harvest. Too little rain at first, then too much. A late blight on the barley, half the stored grain spoiled before winter's end. The Lord had still collected his share, of course. Always first, always more. The peasants were left with what remained, and when there was nothing, they were simply expected to endure. His feet slipped slightly on a patch of clay, but he caught himself. A wasted seed might mean a missed meal months from now. Everything had consequence. The steward moved among them with his arms crossed, eyes sharp. The peasant did not meet his gaze. He never did. When the seed was gone, he returned the empty sack and took up the wooden rake, dragging it gently across the topsoil to bury the grain, to hide it from birds and wind. The birds always came, clever, quick, undeserving thieves in his eyes. He resented them not for surviving, but for doing so without work, without worry. Still, he did not chase them. He had learned that anger wasted strength. By midday, his back was sore and his shoulders burned, but the field was half sown. The smell of earth clung to him now, beneath the sweat and wool and smoke. He paused to drink from a leather pouch, the water inside tasting faintly of moss and wood. It was cool, at least. A breeze picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant blossoms. Somewhere the trees were blooming. He would not see them, not properly. There was no time to wander. Blossoms meant bees, and bees meant honey, and honey was for those who had coin. The peasant had never tasted it. He had heard it described once by a passing monk as liquid gold. Sweetness was a thing told in stories. By the time the sun lowered again, turning gold to orange and orange to gray, the field was nearly done. He stood for a long moment at the edge of it, staring at the furrows like wounds stitched shut, holding within them the fragile promise of food and of staying alive. Not wealth, not comfort, just enough. He walked back to the village slowly, boots heavy with soil, his arms hanging limp at his sides. The path was quiet. A child darted across it chasing a chicken. A woman knelt by the well, her shoulders hunched with the familiar weight of the bucket. Smoke curled from the chimney of the blacksmith's shed. Life had not changed. It simply continued. At the hut, his wife handed him a bowl of stewed greens and lentils, seasoned with nothing but salt. He ate slowly, chewing each bite as if it were something sacred. The children were already asleep, one of them snoring softly beneath the threadbare blanket. After eating, he sat near the fire, warming his hands and staring into the flames. He thought about the seeds buried in the dark soil, waiting for rain, waiting to break open and reach for light. He wondered if they feared the waiting, the uncertainty. He doubted it. Seeds didn't think. They simply endured, like him. He lay down on the straw, joints aching, and pulled the blanket over his chest. Outside, the wind had died. The night was quiet. Sleep came slowly, not from peace, but from exhaustion. As he drifted off, the last thought he had was of a field and the hope, small, distant, unspoken, that the harvest would be kinder this year. The rain returned in the night, soft at first, then steady, then relentless, a hush that flattened the village under a blanket of gray. Morning light came late, filtered through thick clouds and the wet sheen that coated everything: wood, stone, skin. The peasant rose with the sound of water dripping through the thatch, landing in the same clay bowl they always kept beneath the leak in the roof. He moved slowly, the kind of slow that came not from laziness, but from a body that had learned to conserve itself, to ration motion like food. Outside, the world was soaked and shivering. The paths had turned again to thick, sucking mud that swallowed every step with a squelch. Chickens flapped and scratched half-heartedly in the sludge. Pigs rolled in it with a mindless joy he could not understand. His breath fogged in the damp air, his tunic clinging wetly to his back before he even reached the first field. The sowing had finished the week before, and now the wait began. But waiting, for peasants, never meant rest. The fields might be seeded, but the fences needed mending, the ditches unclogging, the tools repairing. Rain made everything heavier, slower, colder. It seeped through the seams of boots, through the cracks in walls, through the skin, and with it came rot. The grain stores would have to be checked, again and again, for mold. The hay in the barns would be turned to keep it from souring. Everything had to be watched, prodded, protected. Nature was not gentle. It was not cruel either. It was indifferent, and that was worse. Today's task was stone hauling. The Lord's men were repairing a wall that had crumbled over the winter. Peasants were needed to carry the stones from a nearby quarry to the manor road. It was not glorious work. It was backbreaking, wet, and endless. The stones were slick and heavy, each one a cold weight pressed into aching arms. The path from the quarry to the wall was narrow and churned with mud, and more than once the peasant slipped. landing hard enough to knock the wind from him. But he said nothing. No one did. A cry of pain was just another sound, to be ignored. He carried stones until his arms trembled with every step. By midday, the rain had soaked him through, and his legs burned with each movement. The overseer barked orders with a voice that carried above the storm, but the sound barely registered. It was like listening through water. By the time the light began to fade again, he had made 20 trips, maybe more. He had stopped counting after the 5th. The last stone dropped from his hands with a dull thud, landing on the stack like one more forgotten weight in a life full of them. He walked back to the village under skies that wept without anger, the rain drumming on his shoulders like an accusation. His boots were full of water, his hands raw from the rough edges of the stone. At the hut, smoke trickled from the chimney. His wife had managed to coax a fire from the damp wood, and a thin gruel bubbled in the pot. The children were huddled around it, arms wrapped around their knees, faces pale and quiet. He stripped off his cloak, hanging it near the fire, though he knew it would not dry before tomorrow. They ate in silence. The gruel was hot, at least, made with barley and bits of wild greens. He swallowed each mouthful slowly, letting the heat spread through him, if only for a moment. Afterward, he sat near the fire, holding his hands to it, staring at the flicker of flame as if it might speak. The rain had begun to ease, though drops still tapped at the roof like a persistent thought. The hut smelled of wet wool, ash, and earth. The youngest child crawled into his lap, curling against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her and listened to her breathing. Small, even, the sound of someone who had not yet learned how heavy the world could be. His wife sat across from him, eyes half closed, fingers threading a scrap of cloth into something useful. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Tomorrow, the stones would still be there. The fields would still need watching. The mud would still pull at their feet. But for this moment, there was warmth. Damp, flickering, fragile, but warmth all the same. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the wall. He dreamed maybe, or maybe not. Sleep, for peasants, was not rest. It was escape. A pause between the rain and the stone and the rising sun. A breath taken in a life that offered very few. The bells from the chapel rang slowly, one dull chime at a time. The sound slipping through the morning mist, like a warning or a prayer, depending on how you heard it. The peasant heard it with dread. Today was the holy day. And that meant work of a different kind. Spiritual labor, some called it. But for him, it was just another weight. Not in his arms or on his back, but in his bones, in his thoughts, where guilt and obedience twisted together like roots beneath the surface of a field. He rose early, as always, washing his face with cold water from a clay basin. His joints ached. The straw had done little to ease his sleep, and the smoke from the dying fire had coated the walls with a black film that clung to everything. He dressed slowly, pulling on his better tunic, the one with fewer holes, the one that smelled slightly less of mildew and work, and helped the children into their threadbare cloaks. His wife tied a strip of cloth around her head and pinched her cheeks to bring a little color to her pale face. They walked together through the village, past other families, all moving in the same direction, heads bowed, not in reverence, but in resignation. The chapel stood at the edge of the manor grounds, its stones cold and green with moss, its windows narrow slits that let in more chill than light. Inside, it was dark. The priest stood at the front, draped in wool, dyed a muddy red, his voice already rising in Latin verse none of the villagers understood. The peasant knelt beside his family on the hard dirt floor, his knees sinking into the same grooves carved by generations before him. The prayer was long, the sermon longer. It was about sin, as it usually was, about pride, about obedience, about the eternal debt owed to God. He listened without hearing, staring at the altar, where a candle flickered against a wooden crucifix, its flame trembling like it knew something the rest of them didn't. Behind him, a baby cried. Somewhere to the left, someone coughed, a wet, rattling sound that echoed in the stone chamber. The priest ignored it. God, he said, sees all, even the smallest thoughts, even the smallest rebellions. When the service ended, the peasants filed out slowly, blessed but not fed, forgiven but still hungry. Outside, the clouds had thickened and the wind had picked up, fluttering the edges of cloaks and turning cheeks red with cold. But the day wasn't over. After Mass came the tithe. 1/10 of everything, grain, eggs, even the few coins scavenged through labor, owed to the church. It was placed in a chest by the chapel door, watched over by a narrow-eyed deacon who said nothing but judged everything. The peasant handed over 2 eggs and a small cloth pouch of dried herbs, the only things they could spare. His wife said nothing, but her lips pressed into a thin line as they walked away. The rest of the day was spent in quiet toil. The boys hauled water from the well. The girls gathered nettles and dock leaves from the forest edge. The peasant mended a fence, hammering rotten planks back into place with nails pulled from an old cart. He paused only once, when his hand slipped and the hammer caught his thumb, splitting the nail and drawing blood. He sucked it between his teeth, tasting rust and dirt. No one came to help. By evening, the sky had begun to clear. A pale sliver of sun broke through the clouds and turned the puddles in the road to patches of gold. The chapel bell rang again, this time to mark the end of the holy day. The peasant looked up at it, its tower rising just above the treetops, and wondered if faith had ever felt like comfort to anyone who lived in a hut like his. Back home, the children were quiet, worn out by hunger and cold. Supper was a watery broth with a few wilted greens and the last scrap of salted pork. They ate it slowly, silently. Afterward, his wife took a piece of cloth and began darning one of the children's stockings, her fingers moving with practiced precision even as her eyes drooped. He sat beside her, watching the fire burn low, its glow casting long shadows across the floor. The chapel bell had gone quiet. The priest would be asleep in his quarters now, warm and dry. The peasant leaned back, resting his head against the rough wall, and stared at the ceiling, where smoke stains marked the years like tree rings. He thought of sin, Not the kind preached from the pulpit, but the kind born of envy, of silent anger, of the question that never left his mind: why some were born to give and others only to take. He closed his eyes, not with peace, but with exhaustion. The holy day had ended. Tomorrow would be the same. Another field, another stone, another mouth to feed, another prayer, maybe, or maybe not. The mornings were lighter now, but light did not mean warmth, and warmth did not mean ease. The sun rose earlier, yes, casting pale gold across the village roofs and stirring the hens into clucking and the pigs into rooting. But the peasant did not meet the sun with joy. It only meant longer days, more hours of labor stretched before him like a road without end. Today was a market day, not for buying, but for standing, for hoping, for maybe trading a little of what little they had. He rose before the first bell, slipped into his damp boots, and checked the bundle his wife had tied with care the night before. Inside were a few cloth scraps, a pair of chicken eggs, and a small wedge of hard cheese, carefully wrapped in linen. Not much, barely anything. But perhaps someone would trade for thread, or a tin cup, or salt. The children still slept, curled under the patchwork blanket, their faces drawn but peaceful for now. His wife stirred and handed him a pouch of water, nodding once, no need for words. He stepped outside, and the path to the market was already beginning to fill with others like him, peasants with baskets slung over arms, or dragging small carts with squealing wheels, all walking with the same quiet determination. The market was a clearing near the edge of the village, marked not by walls or flags, but by the sound of voices, low and uncertain, as men and women haggled gently over the price of necessity. No coin changed hands here, not among peasants. It was barter and hope and the quiet math of survival. The peasant stood near the well, holding his bundle in both hands, waiting for someone to notice. A woman with a crooked spine approached, eyes flicking to the cheese. She offered a needle and 3 beans. He hesitated, not because the trade was poor, but because the cheese was the only thing with flavor left in the house. Still, he nodded. The woman smiled once, just a flicker, and moved on. That was the nature of the market. Quiet trades, brief exchanges, moments of humanity flickering through the weight of shared hardship. A boy with 1 shoe offered to carry a bundle for a strip of cloth. An old man sang a verse in exchange for a boiled egg. A girl with soot on her cheeks sold charcoal drawings on scraps of bark. None of it was for pleasure. All of it was for getting by. The peasant walked slowly through the stalls, his bundle now lighter, but his pouch heavier with tiny treasures. Twine, a tin spoon, a small pouch of dried mint, things that might bring small comforts later. He passed the Lord's men at the edge of the crowd, standing tall, with polished boots and eyes like knives. They didn't speak, but their presence was a reminder. Nothing here was free. The land, the trees, the well, the path, they all belonged to someone else. Even the breath in his chest sometimes felt borrowed. By midday, the sun was high, and the dust from so many feet had begun to rise in thin clouds. The peasant found a patch of shade beneath a broken cart and sat down, legs aching. Around him, others did the same. Children played in the dirt, drawing crude figures with sticks. A woman wept softly over a basket of spoiled apples. Two men argued over the price of a rope, then settled the matter with silence. He watched it all with tired eyes, not judging, not pitying, just witnessing. These were his people, not kin by blood, but by burden. As the crowd thinned and the goods grew scarce, he rose and began the walk home, the sky now dusted with drifting clouds that hinted at rain. At the edge of the village, he passed a small shrine built from stones and bits of wood. Its candle burned low, its saint's figure worn smooth by weather and the touch of desperate fingers. He paused, touched the rim of the shrine, and moved on. Home was the same as he'd left it. Children restless, the fire low, the air inside heavy with smoke and damp wool. He handed the pouch to his wife, and she unpacked it wordlessly, her eyes resting a moment on the mint, then on the needle, then on him. Not thanks, not pride, just acknowledgement. She brewed the mint into a weak tea and gave each child a sip. They smiled, just a little, and that was enough. That night, the wind picked up again, and the sound of shutters rattling against the hut walls filled the silence. The peasant lay on the straw, one arm over his eyes, and thought of the market, the noise, the faces, the trades. Nothing had changed. Not really. But for a few hours, there had been choice. Small ones, but choices all the same. And in a life like his, even that could feel like power. The wind howled and the candle flickered, and still he closed his eyes and drifted off. Not because the world was better, but because the day was over, and that was enough. The fields had begun to change again, slowly, subtly, in the way the earth does when no one is watching. Tiny green shoots pushed through the dark soil like timid whispers, soft and unsure, but alive. The peasant noticed them first while mending a fence at the edge of the barley plot. He didn't smile. He hadn't truly smiled in years. But he stared for a long moment, crouched in the mud, one hand resting on the post he'd just driven into the ground. The shoots meant that the seed had taken, that the frost had passed, that maybe, just maybe, the harvest wouldn't be a failure. But it was too early to hope. Always too early. Hope in spring was like drinking rainwater from a hole in the ground. You could never be sure what poison lay just beneath the surface. So he stood, wiped his hands on his tunic, and went back to work, pretending he hadn't seen anything at all. The days were longer now, and that meant more labor. The Lord's Reeve had begun assigning extra duties, clearing ditches, gathering stones, turning soil on new plots that were barely more than scrubland and weeds. The peasant's back ached each evening with a new kind of pain, the kind that nestled deep into the spine and stayed there, pulsing like a second heartbeat. But there was no time to stop. His wife had taken on extra spinning work, using whatever scraps of wool she could find. At night, the hut was filled with the low whir of the spindle, the faint creak of the wheel, and the rustle of children shifting in their sleep. One of the boys had begun helping with the animals. He was barely 10, but already learning to carry water without spilling, and to speak gently to the goats so they wouldn't kick. The peasant watched him sometimes with a strange mixture of pride and guilt. The boy had strong hands, already blistered, already scarred. A good worker, the reeve had said. But the peasant didn't want his son to be a good worker. He wanted him to be something else, something that didn't exist in this village, something that didn't have to wake with pain and fall asleep with hunger. He never said this aloud. There was no use in wishing for what could not be. One morning, as he walked to the far edge of the estate to repair a collapsed storage shed, he saw a dead bird in the road. A crow, maybe, or a raven. Black feathers soaked from the night's rain. Its wings splayed as if it had fallen from a great height. He knelt beside it, staring at the way the beak curved, the way the eyes were already turning glassy. Something about it unnerved him. Not the death, he was used to that, but the stillness. It looked like it had never moved at all, like it had always been broken. He stood and moved on. The shed had collapsed during a storm, and the beams were rotted through. He spent the day dragging fresh timber from the cart, hammering supports into place, patching holes with straw and mud. The sun beat down steadily, and the sweat ran into his eyes, stinging. By afternoon, the new roof was up, and his hands were coated in sap and blood from splinters he hadn't noticed until they throbbed. The reeve inspected the work and nodded once, then handed him a scrap of bread as payment. It was hard, dry, but food all the same. He ate it as he walked back home, chewing slowly, letting each bite last. At the hut, the air smelled of broth. His wife had found a few carrots and had boiled them with wild herbs and a bone left over from last week. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and the children ate eagerly, licking their fingers afterward. He sat with them by the fire, sore and silent, watching the flames dance along the edge of the pot. Outside, the wind had quieted. No dogs barked, no shouting from the manor, just a rare stillness, like the world had decided, for one evening, to rest. He listened to the sounds of the hut, the soft clinking of wooden bowls, the whisper of cloth being folded, the steady breathing of his youngest, asleep, already in the corner. The peasant leaned back against the wall, knees drawn up, arms crossed, and allowed himself a long, slow breath. There would be rain tomorrow. He was sure of it. The clouds had that look, thick and bruised. And after the rain would come more work, always more work. But tonight, the barley shoots were alive, and the fire was warm, and no one was sick. And that, in a life like his, was something close to peace. Not joy, not safety, but peace. Small, temporary, precious. He closed his eyes and let it settle into him, like a seed in quiet soil. The rain arrived as he'd expected, a soft tapping at first, like fingertips on the roof, then harder, steadier, until it became a presence in itself, a voice that whispered through the trees, through the cracks in the shutters, through the sodden earth beneath the village. It was not a violent rain, but a persistent one, the kind that did not come to wash things clean, but to soak them through, to remind everyone how thin the barrier was between dry and drenched, between shelter and exposure. The peasant rose in the gray light of dawn, his body stiff from yesterday's labor, and stepped onto a floor damp with seepage. The roof above the hearth had begun to leak again. A small bowl caught the worst of it, but the straw along the wall was already wet, and the air carried that sour smell of mildew, thick and clinging. His wife stirred near the fire, feeding it carefully with bits of dried dung and twigs collected from beneath the trees, the only fuel they could find that wasn't too wet to burn. The children still slept, curled tightly together like roots beneath the soil, silent but restless. Outside, the path to the manor had turned to muck, thick and black, and every step sank with a slurp that threatened to pull the boots from his feet. The rain soaked through his cloak within minutes, and the wool beneath clung coldly to his skin. The fields shimmered with standing water. He paused at the edge of one, looking out across the rows of newly sprouted barley, now sitting in pools that reflected the dull, colorless sky. Too much rain could ruin everything, drown the roots, rot the seed. He knew that. They all did. But there was nothing to be done. The sky gave, and the earth received, and the peasant simply stood in between, unable to speak to either. Today, the work was hauling timber from the woods, the Lord's next project being a new granary that would sit atop the hill beyond the chapel. A dry place for his wheat, protected from rats and rot. The irony was not lost on the peasant, that the building to protect food had more care than the people who would never eat it. He joined the others near the forest's edge, each man with a cart or a rope or a length of cord slung over one shoulder. The trees stood tall and dripping, their branches heavy, their bark dark with wet. The heat arrived all at once, as if the world had been holding its breath through spring and had suddenly exhaled into fire. The air turned thick and still, pressing down on the village like a heavy wool cloak that no one could remove. The peasant woke in the early light, already damp with sweat, the straw beneath him warm and musty. There had been no rain for days now. The puddles had dried into cracked earth, and the mud that once sucked at boots had hardened into sharp ridges that bit at bare feet. The fire had burned out during the night, but no one relit it. There was no need. The heat did the work now, filling the hut with a stifling presence that made even breath feel like effort. The children lay sprawled on the floor, their limbs slack, their cheeks flushed. One of them muttered in sleep, dry-lipped and restless. The peasant stepped outside and was met by a windless, sun-drenched silence. The trees drooped. The sky was too bright, a pale, washed-out blue that hurt the eyes. Chickens pecked half-heartedly at the dust, and even the pigs lay still in the shade, tongues lolling, uninterested in food. The stream that once babbled near the edge of the village was now a slow trickle, its banks lined with fish bones and cracked mud. Water would become a problem soon. It already was. Today's work was harvesting early rye. The plants had grown fast in the heat, but the stalks were thin, the grain light. Still, it had to be gathered before the sun baked it to ash. The peasant walked to the field with the others, each man carrying a sickle, each woman with a bundle strap slung over her shoulder, each face drawn in the same tight mask of quiet resolve. The field shimmered in the heat, the stalks swaying weakly, their heads drooping. He bent to his work, slicing the grain low at the stalk, bundling it in his arm, moving steadily down the row. The sweat started immediately, beating on his forehead, soaking the back of his neck, running into his eyes. There was no breeze. No sound, but the soft rustle of stalks, the rasp of blades, and the occasional cough or grunt of effort. They did not speak. Talking took air. Air took strength. The bundles grew slowly. Each armful, tied with twine, tossed into a cart that groaned beneath even the light harvest. The sun climbed higher. The peasant's tunic clung to his ribs. His mouth felt full of dust. Someone collapsed near the edge of the field. An old man, maybe 50, but looking far older. Others gathered, poured a few. Drops of water over his lips, fanned him with a cloth. He did not rise, but he breathed. That was enough. The overseer allowed a short pause, not out of kindness, but out of calculation. A field full of fainting workers was no use to the Lord. The peasant sat in the shade of a small tree, chewing a bit of bread that crumbled like sand in his mouth. He drank from his pouch, warm, metallic water that barely cooled his throat. A fly landed on his arm, and he didn't bother to swat it. There was no energy left for that. After a few minutes, the work resumed. The sun showed no mercy. The grain scratched at his wrists. The sickle handle bit into his palm, reopening an old blister. Blood mixed with sweat. He kept cutting. By late afternoon, the cart was full, though it felt light compared to past years. The grain would be milled, measured, tithed. The Lord would take his share. The rest would be split among the village, too little for too many. But that was the way of it. It always had been. The peasant walked home slowly, boots dragging, head down. His tunic was stained and stiff with salt. At the hut, his wife handed him a bowl of water mixed with crushed herbs. It tasted bitter, but cleared his throat. The children had gathered under a cloth strung up outside, trying to catch any hint of shade. His youngest clung to his leg, eyes wide, cheeks flushed. He lifted her and held her close. Her skin was hot, too hot. Fever. He said nothing, but his wife saw it too. That night, he sat by the fireless hearth, cloth in hand, dabbing water on the child's brow, whispering nothing, just soft sounds. Outside, the air did not cool. The moon rose behind a haze of heat, and even the night birds were silent. The peasant did not sleep. He watched the child's chest rise and fall, shallow, uneven, as the sweat gathered on her skin. He did not pray. Prayers were for those who had something to trade. He had nothing, just the weight in his arms, the burn in his back, and the long, sweltering night ahead. He waited. That was all he could do. Wait and hold on. Wait. The fever broke just before dawn, not with a cry or a gasp, but with a shudder, a twitch of the child's fingers as the sweat cooled on her skin. Her breathing deepened, her limbs relaxed, and though she did not wake, the peasant knew something had passed. He didn't move for a long time. He just watched her sleep, the faint glow of morning sliding across the floorboards like a sigh. His back was stiff, his arms numb from holding her through the long night, but he dared not shift her weight too quickly. It felt like a fragile spell had been cast, and any sudden movement might break it. Eventually, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him, not with fear or pain, but with the hollow gaze of a body still too tired to understand its own survival. He smiled, or tried to, the expression strange on his sun-cracked face. His wife, who had dozed lightly against the wall, exhaled softly and began to prepare a bit of broth with wild herbs and the last of the barley. The other children, sensing the stillness had lifted, moved about the hut quietly, not yet daring to speak. Outside, the air was already warming. The heat had not broken, but it had shifted. A dry wind moved through the village, kicking up little whirlwinds of dust and ash, bending the branches of the parched trees, sending birds scattering from the rooftops. The well near the chapel had dropped again. The water line hovered low, the buckets now scraping bottom with each draw. The old priest said the drought was a test, that suffering drew them closer to salvation. The peasant did not answer when told this. He had no strength for riddles. His salvation lived in the tiny breath of his daughter, curled beside the hearth, skin now cool to the touch. He left her there and stepped outside, knowing there would be questions if he did not show his face in the fields. The reeve would already be taking count. The barley needed tending, though it crackled underfoot like dead brush. Some patches had already yellowed, curling at the tips like paper over flame. The peasant joined the others along the edge of the field, each man carrying tools dulled by stone and sun, their faces hollowed by nights like his. They spoke little, though one nodded at him with a acute look of quiet understanding. He'd heard about the child. Word always traveled, even when mouths stayed shut. They worked in silence, pulling weeds from around the struggling stalks, turning the soil in places where it had crusted, hoping to trap what little moisture remained beneath the surface. It was thankless work. No rain meant no promise, and every hour in the sun felt like a wager with a cruel dealer. But they kept at it, because what else was there? To stop was to starve. And so they moved in slow rhythm, dirt-caked hands clawing at the earth, sweat pooling at the base of their spines, eyes squinting against the glare of the endless sky. At midday, they broke for bread and water. His loaf had gone stale, hard as stone, and he soaked it in water to soften it, chewing slowly under the shade of a cartwheel. The others did the same. One man coughed blood into his sleeve and said nothing. The reeve walked past, counting heads, saying little, his own face pinched from the heat. By the time the sun dipped again, casting the fields in long orange lines, the peasant's body felt like it had been scraped out. He walked home with his shoulders slumped, his thoughts flat and quiet. The hut was warmer than before, but the child was sitting up now, sipping her broth in slow, careful swallows. His wife gave him a look that said everything. Not joy, not relief, but a shared knowing. Another fire endured, another night survived. He sat beside them, one arm brushing hers, his other hand resting on the straw near the child's foot. The children spoke in hushed tones, their voices the only sound in the room, aside from the distant cry of a bird returning to its roost. No fire burned. There was nothing left to cook, but they did not need it tonight. The wind outside had cooled just enough to be kind. The peasant lay back and looked up at the darkening roof, stars beginning to prick the edges of the sky beyond the cracks in the wood. He thought of the barley again. It would likely fail, but maybe some would survive, maybe enough. The girl coughed once, and then sighed, curling into sleep. The peasant reached over and placed a hand on her back, feeling the rise and fall. Still breathing, still warm, and in that moment, beneath the dust and sweat and silence, there was something like contentment, not happiness, not hope, but the knowledge that, for one more day, they had all made it through. And for a peasant, that was everything. The sound of flies had returned to the village, a slow, lazy hum that floated through the fields and alleyways like a song that refused to end. It was the sound of late summer, of overripe fruit left too long on the vine, of spoiled scraps and open wounds, of things that no longer moved. The peasant heard them before he saw them. Thick clusters circling a pile of discarded turnip tops near the smithy, swarming around the carcass of a hen that had fallen sick the week before. He walked past without slowing, the sickle at his side, his face drawn and blank in the rising heat. The barley had failed. Not all of it, but enough to matter. Enough to mean thinner gruel, smaller rations, more debt. The Lord's tithe had come due regardless, taken with quiet ceremony and loud enforcement. Sacks of grain loaded into carts under the watchful eyes of stewards and armed men. The peasants watched with hollow eyes as their work vanished into wagons bound for kitchens they'd never see. No one cried out. No one wept. They simply turned back to their tasks, hands returning to soil already stripped of life. Today was slaughter day for one of the pigs. The animal had gone lame, a swelling in its leg, making it too slow to fatten before the next chill. It would be salted, dried, its fat rendered into jars that would stretch across weeks of meals. The peasant was not the butcher, but he helped. Everyone did. When the time came, the pig squealed as they bound its legs, a high, shrill noise that cut through the stillness like a blade. Some of the children watched from behind huts, eyes wide and blank. They'd seen it before. They'd see it again. Life left slowly, even when done right. Blood ran into the dust. Flies thickened. The smell of it, all copper and heat and musk, hung in the air like smoke. The peasant held the animal's head still, not cruelly, not kindly, just firmly. And when it was done, he stepped back and washed his hands in the trough without speaking. That evening, the meat was divided, some for the Lord's share, some for the village. His wife took the shoulder and the belly, wrapping them in cloth and hanging them near the hearth to dry. A portion was boiled that night with onions and herbs, and the scent of it drifted through the hut like a blessing. The children gathered close, eyes shining for the first time in days. Meat was rare, precious. It brought silence to the table, a reverence not spoken but felt in every careful bite. The broth was thick and hot, the fat clinging to their lips, the warmth chasing away the hollow cold that hunger had planted in their bones. For a moment, there was nothing but chewing, swallowing, sighs of contentment. The peasant ate slowly, savoring each bite, his hands wrapped around the wooden bowl, his body still aching from the day's labor. After the meal, his wife scrubbed the pot while he sat by the doorway, looking out at the sky. It was pale blue now, streaked with pink and gray, the kind of sky that made you believe the day might have meant something. But he didn't linger on that thought. Meaning was for other people, for scholars, priests, lords. Peasants had no time for meaning. They had weather and work, aches and debts, mouths to feed and days to endure. One of the children came to sit beside him, resting her head on his arm, her breath soft and warm. He didn't speak, just placed a hand on her shoulder and let her lean. The flies were gone now, or at least quieted, the cool of dusk pushing them away. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then fell silent. The coals in the hearth had burned low by the time he came inside. His wife was braiding a length of cord, her fingers moving slowly in the firelight. The hut smelled of meat, of smoke, of sweat, and earth. Familiar smells, anchoring smells. He lay down on the straw and listened to the sound of breathing, the rhythm of life held together by threadbare cloth and stubborn hearts. Outside, the stars had begun to appear, faint and flickering through the haze. He stared at the ceiling and imagined them, not as symbols or signs, but as simple lights in a dark sky, distant, silent, indifferent. Like the world, like the gods. He closed his eyes, not with peace, not with joy, but with something steadier, something earned. He had eaten. He had worked. He had survived the day. And in the quiet stillness of a summer night, that was enough. That had to be enough. The wind shifted overnight, slipping in from the east with a sharpness that whispered of autumn, even though the sun still burned high and the dust still clung to every surface. The peasant noticed it first, in the way the smoke from the hearth bent differently as it rose through the thatch, curling toward the door instead of drifting up. A subtle change, but after a lifetime spent with one foot in the soil and the other braced against the weather, he could feel the season turning before the leaves did. He stood in the doorway for a long time that morning, his hands wrapped around a cup of boiled water, watching the sky for signs, clouds that thickened in the distance, birds moving lower than they had a week before, the way the hens stayed close to the coop. It would be harvest soon, though there was less to gather this year. The barley, stunted and dry, would fill fewer sacks. The rye had fared better, its golden stalks now bowed under the weight of grain. But the Lord would claim the best of it. The rest would be measured out by the steward, who carried his ledgers like a sword and his smile like a threat. Still, the fields had to be cleared, and quickly. One bad storm could rot the lot. The peasant stepped back inside, set his cup down, and gathered the tools, sickle, rope, sacks. His wife was already kneeling near the hearth, wrapping small portions of boiled roots into cloth for the day's meal. She handed him one, without a word. He nodded, slung the tools over his shoulder, and headed for the fields. Others were already there when he arrived, their figures bent low, moving in steady rhythm through the rows. The sound of harvesting was soft but constant, blades slicing through stalks, bundles being dropped into carts, the occasional grunt of effort or creak of old wood. The sun was still rising, but sweat had already begun to gather at his brow. The sickle moved in a familiar arc, the motion built into his body like breath. Cut, gather, bind. Cut, gather, bind. The work was old, older than the manor house, older than the village chapel, older than the names on the gravestones by the edge of the field. He didn't look up often. Time passed in swaths of golden stalks and the weight of the bundle strap across his back. By midday, his hands were sore, his knees stiff, and the cloth-wrapped meal had been eaten without thought. The wind rose again as he worked, rustling the tops of the uncut grain, carrying the smell of earth and sweat and something faintly sour, perhaps the compost heap near the woods, or perhaps just the season itself, ripening into decay. He paused once, straightened, and stretched his back, staring out across the field, to where the manor's banners fluttered against the sky. He could see the stewards moving between carts, checking the bundles, marking tallies in their books. He knew what they would say, that it wasn't enough, that the yield was thin, that the village would have to make do with less. He wiped his brow and bent back down. Cut, gather, bind. The day wore on, shadows lengthened. The wind cooled slightly, bringing with it the first edge of evening. When the carts were full, the peasants gathered their tools and began the walk home. The path was quiet, their steps slow, each of them carrying the day in their shoulders and along the curve of their spines. At the hut, the peasant set his tools aside, leaned against the doorway, and looked at the sky. It had begun to shift into that soft gradient of late summer dusk, pale blue, fading to gray, streaked with lavender and gold. A beautiful thing, perhaps, but beauty was hard to taste when your back ached and your stomach was only half full. Inside, his wife had boiled greens and roots in broth. The smell filled the hut, faint and bitter, but hot and welcome. The children ate quickly, speaking only in fragments. The youngest had collected a bundle of leaves and was laying them out in a pattern on the floor, pretending they were coins. He watched her for a long moment before turning back to his meal. Afterward, he stepped outside again, letting the air cool his skin, and watched as the stars emerged one by one. The wind was still rising, steady now, and in it he could hear the rustle of trees preparing to shed. He knew what came next: shorter days, colder nights, a season of hunger edging nearer. But for tonight, the sky was clear. The grain was in. The hearth was lit. The roof, though patched and sagging, held firm. He sat on the stoop with his hands clasped loosely in his lap, letting the quiet settle around him. Behind him, the children were already asleep, and his wife sat darning a torn sleeve by the flicker of firelight. The peasant looked up once more at the stars, ancient and unmoved, and then lowered his gaze, closed his eyes, and let himself rest, not because he believed the worst had passed, but because tomorrow was already waiting, and it would be heavy. It always was. The first true chill came with no warning, slipping into the village beneath the cloak of night, curling under doors and through the cracks in the walls like an old, familiar intruder. The peasant woke before dawn, as he always did, but this morning his breath rose in visible clouds above him, and the straw beneath him felt damp, as if the cold itself had seeped in to take root. He reached for his cloak, pulled it close, and sat still for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light and listening to the muffled silence outside. Even the animals were quiet. The fire had gone out hours ago. The coals were cold. He could feel the hush of frost before he saw it hit, could taste it in the air, could hear it in the creak of the rafters and the stillness of the wind. His wife stirred beside him, wrapping the blanket tighter around the children. No one wanted to move first. No one wanted to be the one to face the bitter air. But the peasant did. He always did. He stood, wrapped in layers too thin to truly warm him, and stepped outside into a world turned pale and sharp. The grass crackled beneath his boots. The fences wore a fine lace of ice, delicate and cruel. The sky was clear. A pale sheet stretched over the hills, and the sun had not yet risen. The well was iced over at the edges, a skin of frost floating on its surface. He chipped at it with a stick, careful not to let the bucket crack, then returned to the hut with cold water that burned his hands. His wife had revived the fire, coaxing it to life with a bit of kindling and patience. She boiled the water and soaked oats for porridge. It was thin, but hot, and the children ate slowly, cupping the bowls in their small hands like they might absorb heat through their fingers. No one complained. They rarely did. Complaints were wasted breath. The day's work would be firewood. What little they had collected in summer was nearly gone. The bundles in the shed were too few and already damp from the leaks in the roof. So he would go to the woods, not the deep forest which belonged to the Lord and was watched by the gamekeeper, but the thickets near the border, where dead branches could sometimes be gathered without notice. It was dangerous, not because of wolves or robbers, but because being seen meant a fine they could not pay. Still, cold killed more surely than the lash. He took a hatchet and a rope and walked alone, past the edge of the village, past the last stone marker, into the thin line of trees. The frost was heavier there, the shadows deeper. The trees groaned softly in the wind, their limbs brittle, their bark weeping sap hardened into amber beads. He worked quickly, hacking low limbs, dragging fallen branches into a bundle, tying it tight. The sound echoed too loudly in the stillness, and he paused often, listening for the snap of a twig under someone else's foot. But the woods remained silent. Just the wind and his breath and the steady thud of his heartbeat in his ears. When the bundle grew too heavy to drag easily, he heaved it onto his back and made the long walk home, each step an effort, each breath a cloud. His fingers were numb by the time he reached the village. Inside the hut, his wife had laid out drying cloths near the hearth. He dropped the wood with a grunt and sank beside the fire, holding his hands over the flames until the pain of returning warmth made his eyes water. The wood would last a few days, maybe longer if they rationed it. That night, the fire burned brighter than usual. The warmth didn't reach the corners of the hut, but it softened the air enough to keep the children from shivering. They huddled close, their bodies overlapping, like kittens in a nest. His wife dozed with a bit of mending in her lap, the needle fallen to the floor. The peasant sat with his back to the wall, eyes on the fire, one hand resting on his knee. He could feel the weight of the season gathering around them, the hunger, the frost, the long nights. There would be sickness again, there always was. But for now, the hut was warm, the fire danced, the children breathed softly, and the cold Though waiting just beyond the door had not yet come in, he closed his eyes, knowing it would be back. It always came back. But tonight, he had outlasted it. Just one night, just enough. The wind howled like a voice remembering its own name, scraping along the sides of the hut with a low, drawn-out groan that made the children curl deeper beneath the blankets. It had been blowing for 3 days now, constant and bitter, carrying with it the scent of frozen dirt and dying leaves, lifting loose thatch from roofs and turning every corner of the village into a funnel of frost. The peasant had stopped counting how many times he had patched the same hole near the top of the wall, stuffing it with straw and mud, only for the wind to claw it free again by morning. Each night brought more chill, more creaks in the bones, more worry in the eyes of his wife as they rationed the woodpile, stretching each log, each ember, until only ashes remained. They had moved the straw bed closer to the hearth, dragging the children with it, wrapping them in every bit of cloth they owned, even the ones they usually kept for mending. The youngest had developed a cough, dry at first, then wet, then quiet in a way that frightened him more than noise ever could. There was no medicine, no healer, not this far from the abbey. Just boiled herbs, cool cloth, and the strange, powerless prayers that crept into his thoughts late at night when sleep would not come. The mornings were the hardest now, not because the work was worse, but because the light that came through the shutters was no longer golden, no longer warm. It was pale and thin, and made the frost sparkle cruelly on the ground outside, a sheet of false beauty over bitter truth. Today, the chore was digging the storage pit again. The last one had flooded when the earth thawed briefly last week, and the roots they had saved were beginning to rot. The new pit had to be deeper, drier, lined with straw, and sealed with stone, or the food wouldn't last another month. He worked alone, using a shovel with a cracked handle and a blade worn thin by years of stone and frost. The ground was hard, and the first hour was spent breaking through the crust, each strike sending shocks up his arms and into his shoulders. His breath clouded around him, rising like smoke. He moved slowly, methodically, too cold to sweat, but too desperate to stop. By noon, the sun had risen, but brought no warmth. He sat for a moment at the edge of the hole, fingers numb and lips cracked, and chewed a piece of stale bread soaked in water to keep it from breaking his teeth. In the distance, smoke drifted from other huts, thin and uncertain. No one had enough wood. No one had enough anything. And yet they worked, each peasant locked in the same rhythm. Survive the cold, find something to eat, make it to the next dusk. He finished the pit just before the sun began to fall again, dragging old stones to line the bottom, laying straw as best he could, covering the top with a board salvaged from a collapsed shed. It would do. It had to. On the way back, he passed the chapel, the small one built of river stones and broken tile. A candle flickered inside, and the priest was kneeling, praying to a god the peasant no longer knew how to speak to. He lingered for a moment outside the door, not entering, not asking, just listening to the sound of Latin words floating into the cold, too soft to understand, too heavy to ignore. At home, the fire was low, but still burning. His wife had made a stew from the last of the beans and a few wilted greens she'd pulled from beneath the frost near the garden fence. It was watery, but warm, They ate in silence, grateful for heat, for food, for breath. The child still coughed, but less. He pressed his hand to her forehead. It was cool. He dared not smile, but he did exhale, slowly, deeply. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters and the fire cast shadows against the wall, the peasant lay beside his family, the blanket shared between them, their limbs tangled together for warmth. He watched the flames flicker lower, the light dancing across the stone floor, and let the weight of the day settle into his bones. Outside, the wind screamed and pulled at the door, but inside, there was stillness, not safety, not peace, but a kind of fragile truce between the world and their corner of it. He closed his eyes, not with restfulness, but with resolve. The pit was dug, the food was stored, the child was breathing, the fire was still burning. For tonight it was enough. For tonight they had won. The first snow came in the early hours, so soft and silent that no one heard it fall. And yet when the peasant pushed open the door just past dawn, the world had changed. A thick white blanket covered everything. Huts, fences, trees, the frozen fields. And the sky above was the same color as the ground, low and heavy and endless. It was the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, a muffled stillness where every sound was swallowed before it could echo. He stood there for a long time, one hand on the doorframe, his breath fogging the air in slow, rhythmic pulses, his eyes taking in the shape of the village now softened into unfamiliar curves. The frost had been cruel, but this was something different. Not harsher, but deeper, like the earth itself had gone to sleep. His boots crunched as he stepped into it, the snow reaching up to his ankles, dry and powdery. It clung to his cloak, settled on his lashes, slid into the seams of his gloves. The children were still asleep, all four huddled beneath the blanket, their warmth bound up together, small breaths rising in unison. His wife stirred near the hearth, feeding the last pieces of dry wood into the fire, wrapping a scarf around her head as she prepared to boil the morning water. He nodded to her once, and she nodded back, a ritual as much as a greeting. Today would be spent tending to the animals, checking the shed for leaks, reinforcing the thatch with what little they had left. The goat had not been milked in 2 days, and he worried about her, old, slow, likely near the end. But she had fed them through 2 winters already. He would not give up on her now. The snow made every movement slower. The door to the pen was frozen shut, the hinges crusted with ice. He chipped at them with the butt of his knife, breath hissing through his teeth as the cold bit through his gloves. Inside, the goat stirred, bleating softly, her breath forming clouds in the dark. He knelt beside her, rubbing her flanks, checking her legs. Thin, but not dying. Not yet. He poured warm water into the trough, watched her drink, and began to clear the stall. The chickens had stopped laying. The pig grunted once and then fell silent. All of them were hungry. All of them waited. The snow continued to fall throughout the day, not in flurries or gusts, but in that quiet, steady way that changes everything without ever raising its voice. He walked to the well and found the rope stiff, the bucket iced into shape. He kicked at the base until it came loose, lowering it carefully through the narrow hole, drawing up water that steamed in the frigid air. The village looked smaller now, closed in by white, as if the horizon itself had crept inward. People moved like shadows, wrapped in layers, heads down, hands full of tools and straw and worry. No one spoke. There was no need. They all knew what the snow meant, the beginning of the long hold. A time of stillness, yes, but not rest. Winter was never still for the poor. It was full of mending and measuring, of scraping and rationing, of watching the sky and listening for the creak of ice where it shouldn't be. That evening, the peasant returned to the hut with arms full of kindling, wet, but it would dry by the fire. His wife had made a broth with dried peas and onion peel, salted with the last of the brine from the pig's leg. The children sat close, bowls in their laps, steam rising like small ghosts from their food. They ate in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the occasional soft clink of wooden spoons against wood. He watched them as he ate, slowly, deliberately, savoring each mouthful not for its taste, but for what it meant, that they had made it through another day. After the meal, he sealed the shutters tighter, pressed cloth into the gaps, banked the fire with care. The snow still fell outside, soft and endless, and he wondered how deep it would be by morning. Lying down on the straw beside his family, he pulled the blanket over them all and listened. The hut creaked. The wind sighed beneath the door. The children murmured in their sleep. The world was frozen beyond the walls, but inside there was breath and warmth and the faint smell of ash and broth and wool. He did not think of tomorrow. He had no room for that. Only this moment, this night, this fire still flickering low in the darkness. And in that flicker, in the hush that surrounded them, the peasant found something close to stillness. Not peace, not safety, but a kind of pause, as deep and quiet as the snow itself. The snow deepened in the following days, layering itself slowly, steadily, with a patience that no storm ever bothered with. It wasn't a blizzard that came howling through the village with fury. It was something gentler and more cruel for it. The kind of cold that came with silence. The kind that made the world smaller each morning, as if the village was being buried grain by grain under a white hush that thickened the sky and made even breath sound loud. The peasant rose each day before light and stepped into a world muffled beyond recognition. The paths had vanished, and even the familiar fences and posts stood only as hunched shapes, shoulders of ice and snow pressing them downward. Every step was work now, knees lifting high through drifts, boots heavy with clinging frost. The old goat had stopped eating. She stood in the corner of the pen, motionless, her eyes half closed. He tried coaxing her with warm mash, with whispered words, with hands rubbing warmth into her hide, but she did not respond. She made no sound, just stood there, quiet and thin, a living shadow. He did not tell the children. There was no point. Let them believe she would recover. Let them have that small hope. They had so little else. The chores multiplied in winter, though the ferme, they were less visible than in spring or summer. Wood had to be chopped daily now, fetched from deep under snowdrifts where it had been buried weeks ago. Snow had to be cleared from the roof to keep it from sagging. Ice had to be broken from the well every morning and evening. The days were short, but packed with motion. Every action slower, heavier, more dangerous. One misstep on ice could break a wrist, a hip, a life. The peasant moved carefully, deliberately, each movement calculated like a man measuring his own limits. Inside the hut, the fire never went out. It couldn't. They fed it constantly. Twigs, dried brush, dung bricks when they had them. Anything that would burn. The air smelled always of smoke, of wet wool, of boiled roots and ash. His wife spent the daylight hours sewing patches over patches, reinforcing their clothes with scraps taken from worn-out blankets. The children helped where they could, darning socks, grinding dried grains, fetching kindling, anything to keep themselves busy and warm. At night, they huddled together in a heap of limbs and breathing, pulling warmth from one another the way leaves drink light. Sleep came in short stretches. The wind scratched at the walls. Mice scurried between rafters. Sometimes he lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if the snow would stop, if spring would ever return. He told himself it would, but he had learned not to trust time. Days passed, blurred into one another by the sameness of the cold and the color of the sky. One morning, he opened the door and found the snow halfway up the frame. It took him half an hour to dig it out. His arms trembled with the effort. When he finished, he stood in the narrow trench he'd carved and looked out over a landscape of pure white. No footprints, no smoke trails, no sound. Just the village buried beneath the weight of waiting. The goat died that night, quietly. She simply lay down and did not rise. The peasant carried her out, behind the hut in the dark, the body light, too light, and buried her beneath a mound of snow where the ground was too hard to dig. He didn't speak, just placed one hand over her side for a long time, then returned to the fire. The children noticed by morning, but none of them asked. They just stared at the empty pen and moved on. That was how it was. That night, they boiled a thin broth, flavored with dried onion and a pinch of salt. It was the last of the onion, but it made the water taste like something more than just heat. They ate slowly, silently. The fire burned low. The wind picked up. The peasant sat with his back to the door, watching the children drift into sleep, one by one. His wife leaned against his shoulder, eyes closed, and still the snow fell. He could hear it against the roof, whispering its slow burial. But inside, the fire glowed, and their breath filled the room, and the weight of survival, heavy though it was, did not yet crush them. He stared into the flames, unblinking, and thought of nothing. Just the warmth. Just the moment. Just the stubborn, flickering refusal to vanish. The snow had begun to melt, just barely, just enough to make the road slick and the edges of rooftops weep into slow drips that froze again by dusk. It wasn't a thaw, not yet, more a hesitation in winter's hold, a reminder that change still lived somewhere beneath the weight of white. The peasant noticed it first in the way the water pooled beneath the eaves, how the icicles cracked quietly in the afternoon sun, how the well water no longer steamed when drawn. He did not speak of it. No one did. They knew better than to trust the sky. The earth could lie with warmth just as easily as it did with frost. Still, something shifted. The days were longer. Shadows returned to the village in new angles, soft and strange. The children sat in the sunlight near the door, sleeves rolled to elbows, their skin pale as moonlight. His wife pulled open the shutters for the first time in weeks and let the air move freely through the hut, even though it carried the scent of rot from the midden pile and damp straw from beneath the floor. The peasant worked with a dull ache in his shoulders, the kind of pain that never truly left, a part of him as much as his hands or his silence. Today, he cleared the path to the storage pit, where the root vegetables were buried deep under earth and ice. Some would have spoiled, he knew, but some might still be good. He shoveled slowly, the snow damp and heavy, and reached the stone covering before noon. Beneath it, the smell was sour, but not unbearable. He reached down into the pit and began to sort, lifting each turnip, each carrot, each pale bulb with care, rubbing them gently clean. Many were soft, already rotting from within. But not all. He gathered what he could into a sack and carried it back through the melting path, boots sloshing in the wet. His wife met him at the door, took the sack, her hands cold and quick, her eyes searching it with practiced precision. They would eat well tonight, at least by winter's standard. Stew, thick with the last of the dried herbs, root heavy and dark with fat from the bone they'd saved for weeks. As it cooked, the hut filled with a smell that felt almost luxurious, earthy, rich, real. The children grew quiet in its presence, leaning close to the hearth, watching the pot with wide, steady eyes. The peasant stepped outside while it simmered, standing at the edge of the clearing, staring toward the fields now hidden beneath a crust of snow and mud. Somewhere below that mess, the soil waited. The barley had failed, but perhaps the rye could be coaxed back if spring came early. He rubbed his neck, felt the scabs on his palms from the wood axe, and tried not to think ahead. Thinking too far forward made the present harder. When he returned inside, the stew was ready. They ate it with both hands around the bowl, swallowing slowly, savoring every piece. It warmed him from the inside out, reaching the parts of his chest that had gone tight in the cold. One child fell asleep before finishing. Another hummed a tune under his breath, something half remembered. A lullaby from the summer. No one stopped him. The peasant sat back against the wall, his bowl empty, his stomach full, and let the silence stretch. It wasn't peaceful, but it wasn't desperate either. Just still. Just enough. The fire crackled low. The snow outside continued to drip from the roof. Somewhere in the darkness, a crow called out once, then was quiet. His wife sat beside him, mending a rip in her sleeve, needle moving like breath. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Her fingers brushed against his once, and that was all. The hut held them like a shell holds water, not perfectly, not warmly, but with a kind of tired shelter that asked no questions and gave no promises. He closed his eyes and listened to the melting, the sound of change, slow and uncertain. He knew better than to hope, but he still listened, because something was shifting. And sometimes, even peasants were allowed to hear the world turn. By morning, the melt had turned the village paths into shallow rivers of mud and slush, a gray, oozing mix that sucked at boots and soaked hems within minutes. The peasant stood at the door, his breath still visible in the air, and watched a chicken wander into the filth, peck once, and retreat, feathers dripping. The snow hadn't vanished. It clung to the shady edges of fences, sat in the hollows beneath trees, lingered in stubborn ridges on rooftops, but its grip had loosened. Water ran from the corners of everything now. It leaked from stones, slid from eaves, pooled in wagon ruts, and soaked through the straw mats lining the doorway. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was motion, and that alone felt dangerous. Motion meant work. Motion meant the start of the thaw, and with the thaw came the reckoning of what had survived and what hadn't. He stepped into it slowly, boots squelching, the cold damp already seeping through the holes he'd stuffed with rags weeks ago. The pen was a mess of muck and standing water, and the last pig, thin, skittish, grunted miserably in the corner, refusing to step beyond the driest patch of straw. He mucked it out with a forked stick, lifting wet hay into a pile outside the fence, the smell of it rising strong and bitter in the morning air. Flies had returned, fat and lazy, rising in slow spirals. The peasant didn't swat them. He barely noticed them. His hands worked steadily, arms aching, shoulders sore from sleep. After the pen, there was the fence line to inspect. Several posts had sunk with the melt, leaning like drunk men into the road. He pushed them back into place as best he could, packing earth around them, feeling the cold water run through his fingers. The task was endless. Nothing stayed fixed. Every board warped, every knot loosened. The world resisted order. He accepted that now. It was in the hut that the real weight of the thaw was felt. Everything was wet. The walls wept. The ceiling dripped. The straw bed squished underfoot, and the smell of mold had begun to take hold in the corners where the cloth had gone too long without light. His wife moved through the hut with a quiet determination, wringing out blankets, scraping mildew from the underside of the table, laying clothes near the fire to dry. Her hands were cracked at the knuckles, red with cold and scoured soap. She didn't complain. Neither did he. Complaining was a habit they had buried long ago, somewhere between the first winter and the second hunger. Instead, they moved like a pair of oxen in harness, separate minds, shared burden. She handed him a bowl of hot water to pour along the edges of the shutters where ice still clung.